He thought they didn't understand a word they were saying. It was their first mistake, and it would cost them everything they had worked so hard to build. The morning sun cast long shadows across the clean streets of Geneva as black cars with diplomatic plates rolled toward the Grand Conference Center that would host one of the most important meetings of African leaders in decades. The building itself was a monument to international cooperation, its glass walls reflecting the flags of every nation in the world. But inside, another kind of war was about to begin. The conference room buzzed with the energy of power and politics. Diplomats in expensive suits moved between groups, shaking hands and exchanging quiet words that could change the fate of entire countries. Interpreters sat in their green booths high above the main hall, their headsets ready to transform the words of presidents and ministers into dozens of different languages. Journalists with cameras and notebooks waited for the moments that would make the next day's headlines. Everywhere, the flags of African nations hung from the ceiling. As colorful reminders of the continent's diversity and strength, Africa had certainly shown itself to be strong that day. The delegation area was filled with some of the continent's most powerful people. Presidents who led millions of people sat next to economic ministers who controlled billions of dollars in trade deals. Military advisors who had seen wars and peace negotiations sat alongside diplomats who had spent their lives building bridges between nations. Their gold plaques gleamed in the conference room lights, each representing a country with its own hopes, dreams, and struggles. These were people used to being heard, to having their words carry weight and change the course of history. But the real conversations, the ones that really mattered, weren't happening in front of the cameras, where everyone could see them. They were whispered through headphones, passed from year to year, and somehow changed along the way. Words were twisted, meanings distorted, and the truth buried under layers of careful translation that seemed innocent but were, in fact, very dangerous. At the end of the Burkinabe delegation, almost hidden among the more important figures, was a young man who looked completely out of place. Amid all the power and prestige, he wore a simple black suit that looked like it had come from a department store. Nothing fancy or expensive. He had no medals on his chest, no ribbons to show his rank or achievements. He had no entourage of advisors whispering in his ear, nor a bodyguard nearby to protect him. He just sat there calmly watching everything and everyone, with an attention that most people never noticed. The other delegates occasionally glanced at him, out of the corners of their eyes, but no one really noticed him. Some thought he was an aide to an important official, someone there to carry suitcases or take notes. Others assumed he was part of security, perhaps a secret agent monitoring the meeting. A few wondered if he was a reporter for a small newspaper, or a student who had managed to gain access to observe this historic gathering. But no one in that room, not even the other African leaders, knew he was watching President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. He had traveled to Geneva completely alone, which is almost inconceivable for a head of state. No red carpet had been rolled out at the airport. When his commercial flight landed, no black car escort with flashing lights had accompanied him through the city streets. No flag had been raised in his honor, and no ceremonial guard had greeted him as he passed. He had simply walked through the airport like any other passenger, taken a regular taxi to his hotel, and showed up at the conference center with nothing but a single notebook and a very specific reason for being there. The problems had started early, with something so small that most people completely missed it. It was a single sentence, a line of translation, that came through the headsets and speakers, scattered throughout the conference room, but that sentence was like a crack in a dam, and Ibrahim Traoré was one of the few who noticed. Nigeria's Ablean president had just finished what everyone agreed was one of the most powerful speeches of the day. He was a man known for his passion and ability to inspire people with his words, and that morning he had spoken with real fire in his voice about something that touched the hearts of every African leader in the room. He had spoken about regional defense and the need for African nations to take control of their own security. Those words were clear, strong, and full of conviction. Africa cannot be defended by foreign hands, he said, his voice carrying through the room with the authority that comes from years of leadership and struggle. Our borders must be ours to secure. Our people must be protected by our own armies, our own police, our own intelligence services. We have depended on others for too long. It is time we stood on our own 2 feet and took responsibility for our own security. The speech was greeted with cheers and murmurs of agreement from the African delegates. These were leaders who had seen their countries struggle with terrorism, civil war and foreign interference. He understood what President Ibrahim was talking about and supported his vision of an Africa capable of defending itself without relying on European or American military forces. But when the translator's voice came through the headsets, carrying President Ibrahim's words to the dozens of other languages represented in the conference room, something had changed. The words that came out were completely different from what had been said. Instead of the strong statement about African independence and self-defense, the translation made it seem as if the president was admitting weakness and asking for help. Africa lacks the capacity for self-defense, the interpreter had said, his voice calm and professional, as he uttered words that President Baby had never said. An international presence remains necessary for the foreseeable future. We recognize our limitations and welcome the continued assistance of our international partners. Ibrahim Traoré had listened intently to both the original speech and the translation, and blinked slowly as he heard the difference. It was subtle enough that someone not paying attention could miss it. But the meaning was completely opposite. Where President BB had called for independence, the translation suggested dependency. Where the original speech spoke of strength, the translation spoke of weakness. Most people in the room were listening with their headphones on, and hearing only the translated version. They were unaware that President Bibi's actual words had been changed. Journalists were taking notes, based on what they heard in the translation. Diplomats from non-African countries shrugged their heads, probably thinking that African leaders were being realistic about their limitations, and somewhere decisions were perhaps being made on words that had never been spoken. The same thing happened a few minutes later. President Maudo of the Democratic Republic of Congo stood up to speak on economic issues. The DRC is a resource-rich country that has been exploited by foreign companies for decades, often with very little benefit to the Congolese people themselves. President Macondo was known as a man who fought for fairer treatment of his country's mineral wealth, and his speech that day was to focus on making foreign mining companies pay their fair share of taxes. His words were clear and direct, because who has just watched his country's wealth go elsewhere? While his people remain poor, Western mining companies have extracted billions of dollars of minerals from our soil, he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. They have made huge profits from our resources, but have given very little back to our people. This must change. These companies must be taxed fairly for the privilege of operating on our territory. They must contribute to the development of our communities and the education of our children. Time to exploitation must end. Again, the speech was met with agreement from African delegates, many of them LED countries that had similar experiences of foreign companies taking their resources without giving much in return. He understood President Ando's frustration and supported his call for fairer taxation and better treatment. But again, when the translation came through the headsets, the meaning had been completely distorted. Instead of a call for fair taxation, the interpreter acted as if President Mohammed was grateful for foreign investment and hoped for its continuation. We deeply appreciate Western investment in our mining sector, the translation said in words President Mao had never uttered. These partnerships have been beneficial to our development, and we look forward to continued cooperation. We understand the need for competitive tax rates to attract international companies, and we are committed to maintaining a favorable investment climate. Ibrahim Traoré said nothing when he heard this second poor translation. He did not stand up object or point out the mistake. He simply listened and watched, but in his mind, he was beginning to understand that something very wrong was happening. These were not mistakes or accidents. Someone was deliberately changing the words of African leaders to make them seem weak-dependent, and grateful for the very treatment they were trying to change. Most people in the conference room assumed that Traoré was just another silent delegate, someone who had come to observe rather than participate. He did not speak during formal sessions, did not ask questions during question and answer periods, and did not try to attract attention when catering staff came by with coffee and pastries. During breaks, he always seemed to ignore him as if he were invisible. When organizers handed out important files, his was always missing, and no one apologized or noticed the oversight. But in his silence, Ibrahim Traoré was doing something that no one else was doing. He was building a map in his head, a detailed picture of what was really happening in that conference room, word by word, sentence by sentence. He compared what the African leaders were actually saying with what was coming out of the translation system, and slowly but surely, he began to see a pattern that revealed something much bigger. and more dangerous than simple mistranslations. He wasn't just listening to the interpreters do their jobs. He was analyzing them, studying their voices, their gestures, their rhythms. He was looking for clues to understand who was behind these deliberate mistranslations that were poisoning the conference, and gradually his attention focused on one interpreter in particular. This man was tall and well-dressed, with a soft French accent that suggested education and sophistication. He wore expensive glasses that were probably worth more than most people earn in a month, certainly more than a UN contractor could normally afford. His movements were fluid and confident, like someone who feels completely at home in high-level diplomatic settings, and there was something in his smile, a misplaced sneer that appeared as the bad translations took effect. His name tag read Paul Lafeber, and according to the conference documents, he was the chief interpreter for the African bloc. This meant he was responsible for translating the most important speeches and statements by African leaders into other languages. He had a huge responsibility and trust that could shape how the rest of the world understood the messages of African leaders. Ibrahim Traoré began to suspect that Paul Lafeber was abusing this trust. In the worst possible way, Traoré began to keep track of every time Lefebvre was interpreting, and something seemed off. He noticed the subtle pauses before important words, the moments when the interpreter seemed to be thinking about how to change a word or phrase rather than translating it accurately. He observed how African LED development was systematically undermined by regional partnership plans, which gave the impression that Africans needed partners to lead their own development. He also listened to the calls for reparations, for historical injustices, to be softened into simple historical recognition by removing any idea of compensation from it. And always there was the quiet, polite, invisible fever in plain sight. He sabotaged everything while wearing a suit and official papers, using his position as a trusted interpreter to undermine the people he was supposed to help communicate with the world. 3 days passed, and with each session, Ibrahim Traoré's discomfort grew. The bad translations became bolder, more obvious to anyone paying attention. But most paid no attention to both the original speech and the translation. They trusted the system, believed the interpreters were doing their jobs honestly, and never suspected that they were being fed lies, disguised as translations. The breaking point came during a closed-door meeting on the 4th day of the conference. This session was not open to the media, with no cameras or recordings allowed. Only strategic figures, major donors, and high-ranking officials were present to discuss sensitive topics. Out of sight, the topic was counter-terrorism cooperation in the Sahel, a vast region of Africa just south of the Sahara Desert. The Sahel has been struggling with terrorist groups for years, and the discussion was to focus on how African countries could work with international partners to address its security challenges. It was a sensitive topic that required accurate translation, because misunderstandings could lead to policies that affect millions of people. Ibrahim Traoré sat in the back of the room, on a seat without even a nameplate. According to the official program, he was not supposed to speak during this session. He was there just to observe and listen, to understand what was being proposed for his region of Africa. As the discussion progressed, different officials and experts shared their ideas on counterterrorism strategies, regional cooperation, and international support. The conversation was complex and nuanced, with multiple perspectives on how to balance African leadership and international assistance, how to respect sovereignty while addressing security threats, and how to prevent counterterrorism efforts from creating more problems than he would resolve. As the session drew to a close, the chair, an experienced Swiss diplomat, asked for any final remarks from the African delegates. This was an opportunity for them to summarize their positions, express concerns, or add points. Before the session ended, several African ministers were preparing to speak when Paul Lefebvre leaned toward his microphone before any African delegate could say a word. Before they could express their true opinions on the proposals under discussion, Lefebvre spoke into the interpretation system with calm and authority. The African representatives have no objection to the proposed deployment of European private security teams to Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, he said. His voice echoed throughout the room over the loudspeakers. They welcome this support and consider it necessary for regional stability. These words hit the room like a bomb. All eyes turned, all conversations stopped. A stunned silence fell over the assembly. Even the African ministers looked shocked and confused. He looked at himself with an expression that made it clear He didn't understand where this statement was coming from. No one had talked about hosting private European security teams. No African delegate had supported a foreign military deployment. The entire discussion was about African solutions, with international support, not about handing over security to European private military companies. But according to the official interpretation, the African representatives had just accepted something they had never accepted. It was a lie, a bold and dangerous lie that could influence policy decisions, donor funding, and the lives of millions of people in the Sahel region. And it had been said with a calm professionalism that many in the room would have believed to be true, had they not paid attention to what had actually been said. It was at that moment that Ibrahim Traoré decided he had seen enough. He stood up slowly, calmly. Without drama or show, he didn't shout, didn't make a fuss gesture, did not demand attention. He simply stood up and, without raising his voice above a normal conversational tone, spoke in perfect French. "Excuse me, but this statement was not made by any African delegate." These words cut through the silence like a knife. The room was so quiet that one could almost hear breathing. Then a nervous movement was heard as people turned to face this young man in a simple black suit, who had just contradicted the official interpretation of the session. The chairman of the session, the experienced Swiss diplomat, adjusted his glasses and looked at Traoré with polite confusion, as diplomats are known to do when faced with the unexpected. "Sir, may I ask who you are?" he asked cautiously. Ibrahim Traoré began to walk toward the front of the room, his movements calm and determined. Each step seemed to echo in the silent room as dozens of powerful figures watched him approach. When he reached a place where everyone could see him clearly, he spoke in a low but authoritative voice. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Startled gasps rippled through the room as people realized they had ignored a head of state for 4 days. Mouths dropped in astonishment as diplomats and officials tried to comprehend what they were hearing. Someone spilled their tea, the cup clattering against the saucer in the stunned silence. Security personnel began to stir, unsure whether to protect this man who had managed to get through security unnoticed. Paul of Ever's face went pale, the confident, smiling interpreter suddenly seeming to see a ghost, or realize that his carefully crafted deception was about to collapse. Traoré turned to the interpreter. His gaze was firm and unwavering. His voice remained calm, but his words had a hard force. "Beneath the tranquility, and you, Mr. Lefevre," he said, "you have been mistranslating our words all week. Not mistakes, not errors. Just deliberate distortions. You have turned our calls for justice into pleas for mercy. You have changed our demands for sovereignty into expressions of dependence. You have poisoned the official account of this summit with lies disguised as translations." The room was frozen in shock. No one moved, no one spoke. No one seemed to know what to do in this unprecedented situation. A president had just accused an official, UN interpreter, of deliberate sabotage, in front of dozens of witnesses, including some of the world's most powerful diplomats. Lefevre stammered, completely distraught. "Mr. President," he began, his voice trembling, "I assure you there has been a misunderstanding." Traoré interrupted. His voice was still calm and controlled. "I speak so many languages," he said simply. "I speak so many languages, including all the ones you've pretended to translate this week. I've listened to both the original speeches and your translations. I know exactly what every African delegate said, and I know exactly how you changed their words." The impact of those words was immediate and devastating. If Traoré really did speak all his languages, he would have caught every mistranslation, every distortion, every lie that Lefebvre had spread during the conference. He had evidence that no one else had, and he had methodically collected it over 4 days. Suddenly, others in the room began to react. A representative from Kenya stood up, his face showing gratitude and anger as he realized what was happening. Then the delegate from Senegal stood up, followed quickly by the one from Mozambique. One by one, the African officials stood up and expressed the same concerns that Traoré had just expressed. "I wondered why my statement on mining regulation was so different in the press," said one minister. "Now I understand why. International donors seem confused about our position on debt relief," said another. "That's why European representatives seem to think we were asking for military intervention," added a third. The full scope of what was happening began to dawn on everyone. For 4 days, Paul of Ever had twisted the words of African leaders, making them appear weak when they were strong. dependent when they were asserting their independence, acknowledging when they were demanding justice. He had created a false image of African positions, influencing policy decisions, funding priorities, and diplomatic relations. The aftermath was swift and efficient, conducted with a quiet professionalism that characterizes high-level international diplomacy. When things go seriously wrong, there was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting or finger-pointing in front of the cameras. Instead, a swift and discreet investigation revealed the true extent of the deception. An anonymous whistleblower, perhaps someone observing the situation and waiting for the right moment to act, provided evidence. Emails were discovered, audio recordings produced, and payment trails revealed, a complex web of deception that went far beyond a simple, rogue interpreter. The investigation showed that Paul Leifber was not just a corrupt translator. He was part of an organized operation linked to a European lobby group with major defense contracts in the Sahel region. This group represented private military and defense contractors with a financial interest in maintaining instability and dependency in Africa by twisting the words of African leaders to make them appear weak and dependent. Leifber helped create a narrative justifying continued foreign military intervention in Africa. These poor translations made it appear that African countries wanted and needed European private military companies to handle their security problems, which provided a lot of money for the defense contractors that funded these services. The ordeal was crushing and undeniable. Emails showed he was given precise instructions on which speeches to target and how to change their meaning. Audio recordings captured him discussing strategies with his superiors. Payment documents revealed large sums of money being transferred from the lobbying group to accounts controlled by Leifber. He was discreetly escorted from the conference center under diplomatic silence, meaning no public arrest, no humiliating appearance on camera, and no sensational headlines. The scandal would be handled through diplomatic channels with discreet investigations and careful damage control to prevent it from becoming an international incident that would embarrass the UN or damage relations between countries. Even if the truth had been revealed and Leifber had been expelled, the damage had already been done. Poor translations had influenced press releases sent around the world, changed donor priorities that impacted funding for development projects in Africa, and affected peacekeeping mandates that dictated how international military forces operated in the region. Somewhere in the world's capitals, policymakers had made decisions based on lies. Journalists had written articles based on distorted information. Military planners had strategized on false ideas about what African leaders really wanted and needed. Ibrahim Traoré could have demanded a public apology. He could have called a press conference and revealed the entire scandal to the international media. He could have used the incident to embarrass the UN, criticize European meddling in Africa, and score political points for himself at home. But he did none of these things. He returned to Burkina Faso exactly as he had arrived. Silently alone, without fanfare or drama, he did not give interviews about what had happened. He did not write op-eds or make speeches about the incident. He simply returned to his job as president, focusing on the real challenges facing his country and its people. Although Traoré remained silent about the incident, something fundamental changed in the way African leaders approached international diplomacy. Word of what had happened in Geneva filtered through diplomatic channels, shared in private conversations between presidents and ministers who had attended the conference. African delegations began sending their own translators to future international summits. They insisted on having their own interpreters during sensitive negotiations, rather than relying solely on translation services provided by the UN or the organizers. They put in place new procedures to check the accuracy of translations and ensure that their words were not distorted. These changes were not dramatic or publicized, but they were important. African countries took greater control over how their voices were heard in international forums, recognizing that communication itself could be a battleground where their sovereignty and dignity were at stake. The following year at the Pan-African Economic Forum in Beba, Ibrahim Traoré entered the conference room to a standing ovation, something he had never experienced before. Word of what he had done in Geneva had spread throughout Africa's diplomatic community, and leaders who had not known this young, unassuming president of Burkina Faso now understood that he had championed their cause. He still wore no badge indicating his rank or position. He still traveled without a bodyguard or entourage of advisors. He still carried only a notebook and maintained the same calm. observant presence that had characterized him in Geneva. But now, everyone in the room knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. In that conference room in Addis Ababa, there was no longer any intermediary between African leaders, and their words, every president, every minister, every delegate spoke in his or her own language, or a language of his or her choosing. Every word was translated by carefully chosen interpreters, vetted by the African delegations themselves, and for the first time in years, African voices resonated, clearly and faithfully on the international stage, without distortion or manipulation. A few months later, when a journalist finally managed to interview Ibrahim Traoré and asked for his opinion on the Geneva incident, his answer was simple and profound. He did not give a long speech on the importance of communication in international relations, nor a lecture on the dangers of foreign interference in Africa, nor a political attack on his critics. Instead, he offered a single, powerful metaphor that summed up the essence of what had happened and why it mattered. Words are like seeds, he said. His voice was calm and thoughtful. If someone else plants them for you, don't be surprised if the harvest isn't yours. Then he smiled that quiet, wise smile of someone who has seen injustice and had the courage to stand up to it, even when no one expected it. And that was all he said on the subject, because Ibrahim Traoré understood something that many people in power never learn. Justice doesn't always come with noise, outbursts, or dramatic confrontations that make for good TV news. Sometimes the most powerful form of justice arrives quietly, in moments of simple truth that cut through deception like a sword through cloth. Sometimes it comes from the unwavering dignity of a person who listens carefully, thinks clearly, and acts courageously when action is needed. And sometimes the most important victories are won not by those who shout the loudest or make the most dramatic gestures, but by those who pay attention when others aren't looking, who see what others are missing, and who have the moral fortitude to speak truth to power when the moment demands it. Ultimately, that was Ibrahim Traoré's greatest strength. Not his ability to speak 6 languages, not his knack for spotting deception, but his understanding that leadership sometimes means sitting quietly, in the back of the room, listening intently to what's really going on, and being willing to stand up and tell the truth when no one else will. Bro,